All right, it's 3 o'clock. My name is Mikko Ailula, and I'm a researcher at Southern Swedish Forest Research Center in Alnarp. And I'm also a coordinator of the IUFRO Working Party 1.1.10. It's a working party working with ecology and silviculture of pine. And on behalf of our group, I would like to welcome you to today's seminar entitled Cembra Pine, the Queen of Alpine Mixed Forests. And I'm very happy to introduce our today's speaker, Professor Peter Spathelf, who is going to give the seminar and who is also a deputy coordinator in our group. Before I will give the floor to our main speaker today, I would like to remind you to mute your microphones and also remind you that the meeting is being recorded. And before we start, I would also like to share a short movie about IUFRO. Let me share the screen. Sorry that it's taking some time. Yeah, hopefully now. Can you see it? Yes.
Forests and trees are diverse and complex and cover about 1/3 of the world's land base. They grow in different climates and environments and on different soils. They come in all shapes and sizes, in groups or alone, have different needs and offer various goods and services. The livelihoods of more than 1/4 of the Earth's population depend on forests. This is why scientists worldwide want to know more about forests and trees. They want to understand exactly how they grow, what makes them healthy, and how to use them. And they want to help them cope with impacts from an increasing world population and climate change. As forests and trees are often at risk of being harmed or lost. For these scientists, the International Union of Forest Research Organizations, IUFRO, has developed a global network for voluntary cooperation, open to all individuals and organizations dedicated to forest and forest products research and related disciplines. It offers opportunities to meet, work together, exchange ideas, access information, and present findings. This avoids duplication, fosters scientific excellence, and increases the visibility of research. Scientists, like forests, are very diverse. They have different interests and needs and work in different environments. IUFRO provides a convenient structure where they can fit in perfectly. 9 divisions with their research groups and working parties are the backbone of this structure. They cover overarching forest-related themes such as silviculture, management, genetics, pests and diseases, economics or social and policy issues. For cross-cutting key topics, IUFRO establishes task forces. IUFRO also offers capacity building for researchers from economically disadvantaged countries. It seeks to strengthen education on forests and increase cooperation with related scientific disciplines and stakeholder groups. IUFRO participates in global policy processes and provides scientific analyses for decision makers, always with a view to reaching the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Currently, IUFRO unites more than 15,000 scientists in almost 700 member organizations in 125 countries. Together, they contribute to the knowledge needed to ensure that all people benefit now and in future years from the economic, social, and environmental goods and services forests and trees provide. IUFRO, interconnecting forests, science, and people.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And once again, welcome to the to the webinar. And now the floor is yours, Peter. Very much welcome.
Okay, thank you. I will now upload first my presentation.
Perfect.
You can see it?
Yes, everything works
And you
fine.
can hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me all. So perfect. Thank you so much. So it's my pleasure to present this talk to you this afternoon. My name is Peter Spathelf. I was already announced by the working group, and I'm currently working at Eberswalde University. And some of you may know Eberswalde was exactly the place where IUFRO was founded in 1892. So we have a special relationship with IUFRO, and 2017, the IUFRO board was at Eberswalde University for celebrating the 125th anniversary. So it's my great pleasure to talk about Cembra pine, Pinus cembra. The title of my talk is The Queen of the Subalpine Mixed Forest. I think this is the third webinar of a series of webinars on the silviculture and management of pine species. And just 2 or 3 years ago, I presented a webinar on Scots pine, which is, of course, the major pine species in Central and Eastern Europe. But Cembra pine is also an important timberline pine species, one of the 111 pine species. So I will look at this species. I will focus on some ecological points. I will look at silviculture, but also at diverse ecosystem services. And we will see the species in several pictures I myself took recently or some years ago, especially in the Alps, because mountaineering is also my favorite hobby, and skiing. So I was very often near Cembra pine forests and could also look at them and take some photos. Okay, these are two slides from, or two photos from Austria on the left, from the Nockberge region, which is in southern Austria, and from right, the Latemar region in the Dolomites in northern Italy. And I think stone pine, or Swiss stone pine, which is one of the many names of Cembra pine, is a character species in the Alps, but not only in the Alps, also in the Carpathian mountains it's occurring. And it's also part of the alpine culture. And I realized this again when I looked at this exhibition in the national park, the Austrian National Park, Hohe Tauern. So the different names of Cembra pine are Swiss stone pine, then Arolla pine. Arolla is a small city in Switzerland. The German terms are Zirbe, Zirbelkiefer, or Arve. And in Latin, which is a small-scale language in the Alpine region in South Tyrol, but also Switzerland, it's also called Cembra. So I will talk a little bit, as I mentioned, about the features of Cembra pine, ecology, growth, robustness, the utilization. I will focus a little bit on timberline as an environment or an ecotone. Then silvicultural approaches or aspects of the management of Cembra pine, and then some considerations on climate change adaptation of this species, and also the look at the diverse ecosystem services forests in these areas are providing, and the the management problems related with that. Some other timberline species are briefly mentioned, and then I come to a conclusion. So you see again, Eberswalde, for those who are not familiar maybe with the location of my university, in this slide, you can see it's in the far east of Germany, the far northeast, so near the capital region. And it's a smaller university of applied science with a large program of green study programs. So among others, forestry, of course, but also ecological agriculture or tourism, landscape ecology, timber sciences, and also economics, some study programs on sustainable economics. Let's go back to Cembra pine and look at some basic features. So you see Cembra pine is really a species from the Alps, but is also occurring in the Carpathian region, even also in Ukraine, maybe one of the most eastern parts of the distribution range here in Europe. So it's a small to medium-sized evergreen conifer, which achieves huge heights, huge ages, and grows to heights up to 20-25 meters. Its needles are in fascicles of 5, and the cones appear after 40 to 50 years. So it mainly occurs, as I said, in the alpine chain. And if we look a little bit further, for example, into a region in northern Italy, so the Valtellinina Valley, and the region around, you can see Cembra pine grows there very often in mixed stands, mixed with Norway spruce, for example, but rarely also in pure stands. It occurs on both calcareous and also acid site environments. In general, it grows up to heights of far more than 2,000 meters of altitude, so 2,500, and some stands or trees are occurring at heights of 2,700 meters. So it's more or less the forest border or the timberline at these altitudes. So Cembra pine is generally a little bit more frequent in the inner alpine zone due to the continentality, the warmer summers. It also occurs in the north and the south, but mostly in these mixed forests with spruce, for example, or larch in the inner alpine area. If you look at one region of occurrence, South Tyrol, in the Sexton region, so in northern Italy, so to speak, we can see Swiss stone pine together with larch. In the succession of the occurrence of these species, larch comes first as a kind of nurse crop or nurse, and then Cembra pine invades. Larch also in these forest types to regenerate needs some more light, so it can be regenerated in more open areas or stand openings like patches or famil groups, or it is artificially held in a stage of advanced nurse crop by, for example, grazing. So larch dominates more on the warmer south exposed slopes, whereas Cembra pine is more frequent on the more moist northern west slopes in the mixed large Cembra stands. If you look at the niches the species is occupying, we can distinguish between the fundamental and realized ecological needs, so according to the Ellenberg diagram. And you can see, of course, pine species and also Cembra pine has a certain physiological optimum. But if competing species occur, the pine species in general and also Cembra pine is outcompeted or is focusing on more extreme sites as the more acidic sites or the more calcareous sites and the very dry sites especially. So together with competition, the realized niche is a different one compared to the fundamental niche. This is true, I think, for all or most of the pine species because it's a light demanding species. This is not so much the case, for example, with the central species, broadleaf species in Europe, which is European beech, which you can also see here, where the physiological optimum is very much similar to the realized niche or the ecological optimum. So the forest types where Cembra pine is occurring belong to the boreal and temperate montane forests and woodlands with large seasonal temperature ranges, cold winters. The soil moisture recharge is also by winter snow, and we have summer peaks in evapotranspiration, to just mention a few features of this ecosystem type. The species group where Swiss stone pine is belonging to is a kind of intermediate to light demanding species. So it tolerates a little bit of shade in its early successional stage or early development stage, but it's in general a more light demanding species. So it's more in the middle, in the first part and the middle of this overview of the functional species groups. Cembra pine is very much dispersed by the aid of an animal, which is the Eurasian nutcracker. It's a dispersal agent, so to speak, similar to a bird, the European jay, which is responsible for the dispersal of oak, for example, of oak seeds, far away from their occurrence, for example, also into Scots pine pure stands, where you can see with time oak emerging. They were distributed very often by this bird. But this is another bird, another dispersal agent, the Eurasian nutcracker. He can transport a lot of seeds, has a certain larger flying distance, and the seed storage per year is very significant, excuse me. So the discovery rate, on the other hand, is relatively high, but that means that the remaining percentage of these seeds is, of course, the potential for the natural regeneration of the species. So you can take this aspect as an interesting feature of dispersal, and the title of this German slide is also the feathered forester, der gefiederte Förster. So an animal which helps to disperse this species. You know, some ecological aspects of the species beyond this. We all know that pine species have a very specific feature which makes them quite robust and quite resilient, also against climate change, by the way, also against fire. That is the tap root. So the rooting of pines are really special and make them a special genus, a relatively robust genus. So it's the fir, the silver fir type of rooting pine has. It's a good root, of course, with a good root energy, and the species develops on fresh and well-developed, relatively acid, raw humus soils. On the north and western slopes, a little bit less on the southern slopes, and it is also significantly mycorrhized. Here you can see another picture with some aspect of the root system. If you compare the growth of Cembra pine with other pine species, of course, it's a slow-growing species. If we take volume growth, increment volume, in these altitudes, so in the special environment of Cembra pine, we see lower growth rates, maybe between 3 and 5 cubic meters per hectare and year. And this compared to other pine species is quite low in terms of volume growth per area. So we have Scots pine, which is the major European and Eurasian pine species, with growth rates between 3 to 5 until 10 to 12, depending on the site index. And then we have the subtropical pines in temperate to subtropical and tropical regions, where we have growth rates which exceed 10 to 15 cubic meters per hectare and year. So you see again the gradient of the pine genus in terms of growth performance, but also in terms of their distribution and some basic ecological features. Concerning vulnerability or forest problems, pest problems, we have to say that Cembra pine is maybe not a very vulnerable species in terms of fungi attacks. It's not a hotspot, what I read when I reviewed some articles. But frequently in the regeneration stage, we can find Gremmenia, snow fungi, and Gremmeniella shoot disease. So some fungi which in many conifer tree species in the younger stages of our stands, when we have a lot of trees maybe and humid conditions and maybe not or stagnant air, so that these fungi infestations can occur. We have less insects specialized on Cembra pine compared to Scots pine. So Scots pine, which is really a species with a lot of insect damaging agents, which were well described, by the way, in the silvicultural and forest protection textbooks. We have browsing and rubbing as a problem. We have lightnings as a potential problem, storms also, and also the isohydric behavior during drought stress, which means that if the vapor pressure deficit in the atmosphere exceeds some specific values, some thresholds, maybe 1.5 hectopascal to 2 hectopascal minus, of course, then there is a closure of the stomata and no relevant sea uptake anymore. Let's go to utilization and focus on some aspects here. If you have questions then on the species in general, on the ecological part, you can raise your questions, of course, afterwards in the question and answers session. Yeah, the features of Cembra pine with regards to utilization. Let's first look at the wood characteristics. So the growth normally of this timberline species starts in mid-May, and it's a slow growth, as we said. In general, the tree rings are reported to be very small due to the very short or relatively short vegetation period. So the wood structure is composed out of tracheids. We have a relatively small late wood zone. So that means the early wood has a larger proportion, which reduces a little bit the mechanical properties in general. But although the species, the tree is very often not very straight or can be irregularly shaped, it is a potentially valuable tree species with respect to utilization. Yeah? So it can be used for high value indoor utilizations, maybe also for furniture. So it is a potentially valuable species, as for example, also Norway spruce as an alpine species from the same region. As you may know, especially in this northern part of Italy, in the Trentino area, Veneto area, you find these growth areas for the music instrument timber. Yeah, Stradivari area is in that region. So it is potentially a growth region where valuable timber can be produced or can grow. Yeah, and we will look at the valuable timber production strategy in a few minutes. Okay, so that is the wood utilization again. With indoor uses, I mentioned it already, construction timber, but also the non-wood forest products part. So the seeds and the nuts with the oil extracts for natural medicine and cosmetics. Also liquors are produced. It is a species which is also positive with respect of its impact on human health. I just recently in the South Tyrol region, I found this nice advertisement of a pillow, so Südtiroler Zirbenkissen, which makes you sleep. And so it is a species which has some very nice features also in this respect. Okay, let's go to the environment where the species is growing. It's the timberline, a very harsh environment for tree growth. As you may know, I'm from Eberswalde, so I'm not, of course, the expert on timberline species in general or on mountainous forestry. But as I said, I'm very often in the mountains for hiking and climbing and skiing. So I'm fascinated of this area. And the timberline is really a specific ecotone. You can see it again here in the Sexton region in South Tyrol in northern Italy, where you can see a kind of close forest. Where we have stands, and then we have more scattered trees and patches and groups of trees. The tree where the tree line is approaching, and that beyond the tree line where the trees are lower than, let's say, 2 to 3 meters, which is the definition, what I saw for the trees within the tree line and the forest part. Then we have smaller trees or dwarf forms of trees. And of course, we have more upwards to the peaks, we have other herbaceous plants. So it's a specific ecotone, which is also well described, and a very nice article is also given by Körner from Basel University in 2014, where he very intensively and comprehensively describes the ecotone of the timberline, and also the impacts of climate change with timberlines. Yeah? So timberline environments, and you can see on the right side a really extreme a site which is not in Europe, which is in Bolivia, near the highest peak of Bolivia. So in the background, Sajama, which is a peak of 6,500 meters above sea level. And there is in 4,000, 4,500, there is still some trees. So really trees, it's the tree line which is occurring there. And it's an environment which is characterized by deep temperatures during the vegetation period. And according to ecologists who studied very carefully the timberline, they say not the single extreme events matter so much, but this deep temperatures during the vegetation period, which means that the trees cannot produce enough matter in this vegetation period for establishing the tissue if they are too far or too high, above these still living conditions for trees. So other factors are frost drought, so water shortage, when assimilation is taking place, but not enough water is there, and then competition by other plants or snow. So timberlines can vary very much. So from 4,800 meters, as I mentioned, in Bolivia, to 1,800, maybe more in the northern Alps, and 2,500, 600, 700 meters in the central Alps, for example, in the Engadine region, or even in Tyrol, in some areas, in the Ötztal, the timberline is above 2,000 meters. And Cembra pine is playing a role there. Interestingly for me was to learn that the timberline in the alpine region was shifted down by anthropogenic measures, for example, during the last decades or even centuries, when the Alpwirtschaft or the grazing system was developed in this area. So the trees were cut or disappeared due to the establishment of this grazing system. So normally the timberline without this anthropogenic factor should even be or should have been higher. But today we have other problems. We have maybe the abandonment of the grazing system, the Alpwirtschaft, Almwirtschaft in these regions. And we have climate change, which is shifting again timberline. So species are migrating, or if they can migrate upwards. And maybe if the peaks are too low, finally, these species can also disappear, and other plant species, not only the trees, but the plant species in general can disappear. So timberline is also affected by climate change. Cembra pine in the Alps, as I said, is occurring in these mixed stands, very often with larch. So larch is a mixed species, which you can see very often in the inner part of the Alps. Again, here some examples from Austria or northern Italy. Okay, so timberline is also occurring without Pinus cembra. For example, in the Bavarian Alps, this picture, the dwarf pine Pinus mugo is building or establishes the timberline here. And in the Helm area, again, in this northern Italian region, where the Dreizinnen or Trecime area is, you can see that especially larch on the southern slopes is larch and spruce even is the timberline species, especially on the southern or south exposed slopes. and Cembra pine is occurring more on the northern and western parts. And we have Cembra pine also in other areas in Central Eastern Europe. It's the Ukrainian part of the Carpathian Mountains where I found this description of the distribution of stone pines with stone pine. So it is occurring there on relatively poor, edaphically poor sites, but also on transition sites, and it's mixed similarly to Central Europe with Norway spruce, for example, and especially the stands are quite open there in Ukraine. It can be seen a little bit in these pictures, which I received from my colleague Vasil Lavny in Ukraine at the National Forestry University of Ukraine in Lviv. So more open stands with maybe ground closures of 0.3 or 4 represent the Cembra pine stand. So it's a lower stocking level, and this, of course, facilitates the regeneration and the survival of Swiss stone pine seedlings and the advanced regeneration there. I think we may not need the break. So I had this slide if somebody really needs a break, but I think we may go ahead. And I now come to silviculture and the management of Cembra pine stands. As you may know, the silvicultural practices, we can apply this cycle nearly everywhere, especially in Central Europe, where we are committed to close to nature or to continuous cover forestry. Of course, we do not have much site preparation, and we don't have fertilization or some very intensive silvicultural practices. But of course, we have regeneration, we have pre-commercial thinning, yeah, as major stand treatment measures. So first, maybe some comments on the artificial regeneration of Cembra pine. There was a nice study which was done in Switzerland in the canton Fribourg, where Swiss stone pine was planted after the Second World War and then assessed again recently. And many of the thousands of trees which were planted were lost, so died, and only a few were left. And the reasons which were mentioned in this study for that loss was maybe the case that the trees were not container plants, maybe, and also the false provenance. So that is what I found. So what is recommended for planting is ball planting and container plantings, especially adapted to the roots to these plants. So whole plantings, some terracing may be recommendable to reduce the snow damages, and very cold and humid microsites should also be avoided. So especially with some significant competition. So, and of course also the provenances should be adapted to the region where they are planted. So plantings in clusters maybe can be recommended, not the whole area. So to complement also natural regenerations. Planting details, the LICO system I saw recently when I was in Austria for a small period at the BOKU. So, and the the advantages of container planting and the possibility to work with appropriate devices for a efficient and very sound planting, yeah, and also a successful planting. So these are some details I would like to show here. But natural regeneration, on the other hand, is a preferred method, of course, in all our forest enterprises, at least in our Central European countries, in Switzerland at least, and I think also in Austria and Germany. We have currently natural regeneration percentages of 80% of all the regeneration activities. It is still different if you go a little bit more to the continental part of Europe. I heard in Poland is still vice versa, so maybe 20% natural regeneration, or in Ukraine the same, and still quite significantly planting activities. So natural regeneration, of course, have to be adapted to the light requirements of these species of the mixed alpine mountainous forest. Whole patch cuttings, which create, so to speak, smaller clear cuts even, or patches, or even strip cutting can be an option to provide enough light in this short vegetation period for facilitating the establishment of the light demanding species, so larch, sometimes Scots pine, also Cembra pine, and also Norway spruce as a kind of intermediate tree species. So this is, of course, different to the regeneration of broad-leaved species, beeches, more in continuous cover systems with single tree intervention types. I think these species require a little bit more light for a successful regeneration. All right, again, a picture from the Engadine, from this central part of the Alps, where these mountainous mixed forests occur, also with Cembra pine and this typical mixture. The question of tending now is, I would say, is following some general rules we have everywhere. So we have the possibility of pre-commercial interventions in very very rich in stem number. Where we reduce this competition and do some pre-commercial thinning. And then we have, of course, thinning with the possibility of the selection of future crop trees when, for example, we can see or can find a branch-free stem section of 4 to 6 or 8 meters. Then we can identify or release a future crop tree by removing some significant competitors in a kind of high forest intervention. So that is possible, and there are also in some silvicultural prescriptions such measures prescribed or recommended. Something similar or in this direction I found, for example, in the silvicultural guidelines of the Landwirtschaftskammer in Austria recently. But I also heard from colleagues, for example, in South Tyrol, that very often these intermediate cuttings, especially on private land with private forest owners, they are not occurring. So they do not thin really because it's very expensive and maybe the assortments you can produce cannot be sold with good prices. Maybe it's even impossible, the access to these stands, so that thinning is very often omitted. So I heard that from some parts of South Tyrol. So the final harvest then is when you have a certain target diameter of these species of Cembra pine, in our case of maybe 50 centimeters, 50, 60 centimeters. I want to just remind you briefly to the two-stage strategy or two-phase strategy for high valuable timber production. You see it follows these two stages. In the first stage, we look on quality. We prune, either artificially prune. This is the case with conifers. It would also be the case with Cembra pine or Norway spruce normally. And then we have a certain branch-free timber section in the first section, the potentially most valuable section. And then if we have reached that, so if we have finished this first stage, we select future crop trees, or we select these trees as future crop trees, and then we release them. We remove some competitors to accelerate the diameter growth of these species. So to go into diameter, so to speak, and to maintain a certain crown ratio also. So maybe 50% of the crown is maintained in order to have a good assimilative capacity for the production of these larger diameters. So that's a two-stage approach for valuable timber production, of course, which can be used or applied for Cembra pine, and for the other alpine species with potential high value. An interesting question is whether these pine species and also Cembra pine is feasible for the continuous cover forest system, Dauerwald, the German term, in general, or the retention systems. So I have some concerns with planter forest and pine species. We still do not have many good examples because the canopy which can be retained for growing, for developing younger pine trees, for further developing them so that they can have access to the upper canopy. So the canopy which can be retained here is relatively small. So it's maybe 10-20%. So in the range of the seed tree or the shelter wood system, but it's not a closer canopy, such as with beech, for example, or mixed beech forest. So the retention principle is maybe critical with respect to the application of pine species or with pine species. So what about the climate change now and the susceptibility of these alpine mixed forests? Especially in South Tyrol, I could see just a few weeks ago a lot of damages, also some recent damages, which are the same or have the same complex of reasons as damages in our lowlands. So storm damage maybe as a triggering factor, and then bark beetle attacks, and then a kind of mortality circle is starting. We saw this, or we can see this in the Pustertal area here. And we saw, of course, a lot of damaged areas in northern Italy due to the storm Vaia in 2018. So the problems for the colleagues in northern Italy is the same as for many German foresters, for example, in the Harz or in the Sauerland, to have larger areas to be reforested, because we have, according to the law, we are obliged to reforest these areas after some years. Yeah. Okay. Now, climate change adaptation and some aspects at the end of my talk. I have to come to the end. So the key for the adaptive capacity of our forests for a changing climate in the future, of course, is genetic diversity. It's not the only factor, but it's a fundamental factor. Genetic diversity and in general diversity matters here to provide many response options of the forest ecosystem in case of disturbance. Then a future development is maybe more easy compared to a narrow stand in terms of the genetic constitution. So this is important, and this was already analyzed in some very good studies in Switzerland, where the genetic diversity of these Cembra pine stands were evaluated. So the adaptive traits matter, of course. Just one aspect for the discussion. The adaptive traits are essential. So traits, species traits, which have to be seen with respect to the fitness of the trees or the plants. And we also know that there are neutral traits which are not so important in terms of the climate change question. But the adaptive traits are important. So frost tolerance, drought tolerance, for example, etc. And again, the key for developing more resilient stands in the future is functional diversity and maybe also redundancy, as it was shown in several articles and also very well described in, for example, some works of Christian Messier from Canada. So the functional diversity allows the system to respond to different disturbances and different developments without larger damages in these homogeneous systems, as a comparison to that. What about some first studies on Cembra pine compared to larch? I found these graphs and many of the analyses in one fundamental article of a Swiss colleague from the Swiss Research Institute, Gugali et al. So many of the information I found in this article, for example. And we see here in this sequence of tree ring analysis that larch especially seems to benefit from the warmer climates in the recent period, but not so Swiss stone pine. So the competition relations between these species may change. As you all know, I think in the tree rings we see a lot with respect to future damages. So if a species dies, very often you can see 10, 15 years before in smaller tree rings that the growth is reduced and the tree has some problems or starts with some severe problems. So here we see that this is maybe differing between larch and Cembra pine. And as a consequence, I already mentioned this earlier, we have changes, forest range distribution, changes also in the timberline zone or in these higher altitudes of our mountainous areas, so that species may migrate themselves, or if the velocity of migration is maybe not fast enough, we can assist with the migration, or can do assisted migration. So in the form of assisted population migration into higher elevations where it gets warmer, or even assisted range expansion, which is ARE, or the third aspect or variant of assisted migration would be the assisted species migration. This is something we can find with, for example, the transfer of the North American or East Asian species to Central Europe, maybe 100 and 115 years ago. But maybe assisted population migration is an option to adapt our forests to climate change, our mountainous mixed forest to climate change. You see two other adaptation strategies. This is what I said is the migration, the natural migration, again, the gene flow into the system, but also the genetic adaptation on site, and also what we should not overlook, the phenotypic plasticity. So you can also synthesize this under the term epigenetics, which is complicated, and I'm not a geneticist, but there are some first analyses, for example, in the Finnwald area in Switzerland, in the Rhone Valley, where epigenetic adaptations could be proven in drought-stressed pine stands, so that the offsprings are also better adapted to droughts without changing the genotype of these populations. So, but it's an area which lacks still research. Yeah? But it facilitates a little bit this epigenetic adaptation. It opens more room for adaptation, yeah, for our forests and plants beyond the evolutionary adaptation and maybe the species migration. So Cembra pine, finally, in 5 minutes, I'm through. These stands are very important, of course, with respect to aesthetics. So these are wonderful stands very often. Aesthetically very beautiful to look at and to hike in, so for recreation, but even more important, natural hazard control. With these stands, I just give you again an example from this ski area of the Dolomites. And you see some houses or a village which was normally protected by a mixed Cembra pine, spruce and larch stand, and it was damaged by the storm Vaya, and artificial protection measures have to be or had to be installed, established for protecting these values which are at stake. Yeah, so the humans, but also the monetary values, so the houses and the infrastructure, etc. So for these natural hazard protection against avalanches, for example, there are some features identified how these forests should look like. So the irregularity of the tree distribution matters. The number of trees is important in such a stand, so that these natural hazards do not establish or develop. So avalanches or in summer rockfall, for example. And the share of stable conifers is reported to be important for this avalanche control. And also residues, harvest residues, for example, as obstacles. So very important, and we could also do this, and this is done to calculate the value of the forest with respect to natural hazard control, with cost value estimations, but also with other approaches. And finally, the cultural value of these stands I show here, a mentioned region in Tyrol, in the Ötztal, the Ötz Valley, where some wonderful Cembra pine forests are in these timberline areas, and these are beautiful stands. They have a high value from an aesthetic point of view, a high cultural value. And I think I would say, as a non-alpine resident, but I would say they belong somewhat to the culture of the alpine region, as for example, maybe silver fir belongs to the, or is a character forest species in the Black Forest or in the Allgäu, or the Araucaria tree species is a character species in South Brazil in the Atlantic rainforest. So other timberline species, I come to the end, can be mentioned. I just give you here 3 other pines which are occurring at timberlines in the Eurasian part of Europe and Asia, and in North America in the Rocky Mountains. And again, I mention Pinus mugo as a very well-known dwarf, very often in the dwarf form, timberline species in the Northern Alps, in Bavaria and other regions. So to conclude, I would say that Cembra pine is a very important alpine, not very frequent species, but an important character species of the Alps and also a little bit of the Carpathians, going to higher altitudes and establishing with other tree species, very often or sometimes the timberline, mostly in mixed stands. It's a potentially valuable tree species or timber species, which has an even higher value for the protection against natural hazards. And it's also important with respect to other amenities, so the landscape aesthetics, the cultural value. So this has to be mentioned. And it's, I think, relatively robust, but has further potential for adaptation to climate change, but maybe not in lower elevations. And I think together with other pine species, it's not really perfect for true continuous cover or Dauerwald planter systems due to the ecological behavior of this tree species. So, and with this, I want to thank you very much. I was a little bit over time, but I hope there are still some 2 or 3 questions. I thank you very much for your attention and patience. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Peter. I think it was an excellent presentation, extremely interesting. And I think we have still time for some questions. So I will maybe just stop recording.